You know what? I can't psychoanalyze him from a distance, Christian. But as I mentioned in the book, right from the beginning, we had somewhat of a pretty good rapport. And I believe it was, like two people from New York City. He was from Queens, I'm from Brooklyn. We had that kind of New York City rapport with each other, and we got along very well. So as the months went by, early on, there was no problem between us. But as the months went by, and I had to contradict things he was saying, then he would call me up and yell at me and saying, "What are you doing? You got to be more positive." But I think deep down, he really didn't want to conflict with me. And that's the reason why he would always say, even when he would be yelling at me on the phone at night, he would end it up by saying, "We're still okay, Tony, right? We're good." That was okay. But his staff didn't feel that way. So even though he said, "We're good, things are okay," his staff started to undermine me and try to reduce and actually diminish my credibility in the White House. So even though he was saying things were okay, they were not okay in the White House staff.
Well, that's an amazing description because already you were having to gird yourself, kind of doing public battle with the most powerful individual in the world when so many lives were at stake and you were trying to, navigate that. And then, of course, his staff were too scared of him to understand, I guess, his relationship with you. But I want to go back to the beginning because you've really been in a battle trying to solve these massive health issues. And people may now know you mostly from COVID, but really it goes back at least to the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And you say the moment you read that 26 otherwise healthy gay men were infected with a disease about to die, you got goosebumps, and that you may still have some PTSD from that time. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, HIV/AIDS, Christiane, was transformative in my professional career and in my entire life. I mean, one would see if you read the book, that, I spent 40 plus years dealing with HIV/AIDS, as opposed to, 3 or 4 years dealing with COVID. And in the early years of HIV, not very many people remember that, but it was absolutely devastating. I was so enthralled by how terrible this disease would turn out to be when most people didn't think it was going to ultimately be that bad, that I changed the direction of my career and stopped the successful things I was doing and devoted my entire professional activities to taking care of desperately ill, mostly young, previously otherwise healthy gay men. And those early years were devastating. And when I just describe in the book that I believe, like many of my colleagues who were doing it back in the early 80s and mid 80s, we did develop some form of post-traumatic stress because we were physicians and we were trained to heal people. And no matter what we did, almost every one of our patients would die a very difficult death. And to do that day after day after day was a very traumatic experience. Certainly personally for me it was, and for all of my colleagues that I describe in the book. But the good news is that what science gave us was the solution. And as we got into the late 80s and into the 90s and the mid 90s, then we developed drugs that were absolutely spectacular in suppressing the virus and allowing people to live normal lives, essentially with a normal lifespan. Mm-hmm. So although AIDS is one of the most devastating public health stories, it is also one of the most important success stories of biomedical research.
Amazing. And then, of course,
people, he said, "Oh, well, this will be available in a year." I said, "I'll be dead in a year. Thanks. What good's that going to do me?"
A year ago, the San Francisco architect hoped an experimental drug called Compound Q would be the answer. That it turned out not to be, as a familiar refrain in an epidemic that some feel has been driven less by science and more by false promises and politics.
Our power is in medical science's ability to find the answer, and it will be found. Whether it's found in time for me, I don't know. I hope so. Probably not.
It's very important to relook at what we've been doing and try and fine tune it, turn the knobs, tighten up the system.
The director of AIDS treatment research for the federal government envisions a strike force for clinical trials that can speed the pace of promising research.
Focus a little bit more on the important problems, eliminate the poor performers, fund more of the good performers, and implement other systems that can get things done in a very rapid way.
It's really remarkable. You end that segment being very methodical, very logical, and research-driven. The man the victim, the patient, was named Joel Gannick, and he actually did die a year later. I mean, you went through really, you know, a bit of. It was quite hard what you went through with the AIDS activists basically calling you out. As you remember, of course, Larry Kramer called you a murderer, ended up being, you know, very closely collaborating with you, but they wanted you to give them the experimentals now because they couldn't wait.